The rotten fence post snapped without warning, and a heavy rail came crashing toward Helen Brooks before she could get clear. Arthur Collins slammed his truck into the mud, threw open the door, and reached her just as the timber struck the ground. He caught Helen around the waist and pulled her backward. Her boots slipped beneath her, and for one sharp second, both of them nearly went down beneath the broken rails. Helen was 49, widowed, and stubborn enough to wrestle a storm-damaged fence alone. One sleeve of her coat was torn. Blood ran from a scrape across her palm, but she looked at the fallen wood instead of the injury. "I had it," she said breathlessly. Arthur glanced at the post lying in the mud. "No, ma'am, it had you." Beyond them, 3 horses pressed nervously against a remaining fence. If another section gave way, they would reach the county road before sundown. Dark clouds still hung above the Montana fields, and the wind carried the promise of colder weather. Arthur had driven past Helen's small ranch many times since her husband died. He had seen her hauling feed, repairing gates, and carrying burdens meant for 2 people. She always waved. She never asked for help. But something in the way she hid her bleeding hand told him this fence was not the only thing she had been holding up alone. Helen bent for the broken rail. Arthur picked it up first. "I appreciate what you did," she said, "but I can finish." Arthur set the rail across 2 posts and reached into his truck for his tools. "You got spare lumber?" Her mouth tightened. "Behind the barn." "Then we best use it before those horses decide. Wyoming looks friendlier." For the next several hours, they worked beneath a sky turning gray. Arthur dug out the ruined posts while Helen measured boards and held each rail steady. At first, they spoke only about nails, hinges, and weathered timber. Then Helen laughed when Arthur struck his thumb and muttered something too quiet for a church pew. It was a small laugh, surprised and warm. Arthur looked up. For the first time, Helen did not seem like the lonely widow at the edge of town. She simply looked like a woman who had forgotten how good it felt not to work alone. By late afternoon, the horses stood safely behind a straight line of new rails. Arthur gathered his tools, while Helen ran her fingers across the final post. "You didn't have to stay," she said. Fence needed fixing. Helen turned toward him. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes held something warmer. "I need a strong man like you." Arthur went still. Maybe she meant the fence. Maybe she meant the ranch. A sensible man would have taken it as gratitude and driven home. But if you had seen the way Helen looked at him, you might have wondered the same thing Arthur did. Before he could answer, the wind lifted the loose edge of her scarf between them. Helen caught it, suddenly uncertain, and stepped back. Arthur tipped his hat and climbed into his truck. All the way home, her words followed him down the empty road. And behind him, Helen remained beside the repaired fence, watching until his taillights disappeared. "Đã kiểm tra. Phần này bám đúng dàn ý và không lặp câu cuối phần trước. Ước tính ký tự phần này khoảng 3.500 ký tự. Ước tính tổng ký tự lũy kế khoảng 3.500 ký tự. Trạng thái độ dài vẫn trong kế hoạch." Arthur expected Helen's words to fade by morning. Instead, they followed him through every chore. While he scattered hay across the pasture, he heard her voice. While he repaired a loose gate behind his own barn, he remembered the look in her eyes instead of the sentence itself. "I need a strong man like you." George Parker noticed before anyone else. "You've hammered the same nail 3 times, his old friend chuckled from the fence line. "Either that board's the hardest piece of oak in Montana, or your mind's somewhere else." Arthur gave a dry smile. "It's just been a long week." George folded his arms. "Uh-huh, and I suppose that has nothing to do with Helen Brooks." Arthur didn't answer. George laughed. "I'll take that silence as a yes." Arthur changed the subject, but George had known him for nearly 40 years. He knew Arthur only became quiet when something mattered. The next afternoon, Arthur loaded a toolbox into his truck. He told himself he was only driving past Helen's ranch to make sure yesterday's repairs had survived the night wind. Nothing more. The fence stood exactly where they had left it. Straight. Solid. Helen was carrying 2 buckets from the well when she noticed a truck. She smiled before she realized she was smiling. Fence inspection? Arthur looked at the rails. Figured I'd make sure I didn't leave you with crooked work. Helen raised an eyebrow. So, you're inspecting your own craftsmanship. I suppose I am. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Helen laughed. It was softer than the day before, but easier. Well, she said, since the inspector's already here, would you accept a cup of coffee? Arthur hesitated, only long enough to be polite. I reckon I could. Her kitchen was simple. An iron stove warmed the room. Fresh bread cooled beneath a cloth. A faded photograph of Helen and her late husband rested on the mantel beside an old brass clock that had long since stopped keeping time. Arthur noticed it without staring. Helen poured coffee into 2 heavy mugs. Neither hurried to speak. Silence between strangers feels awkward. Silence between 2 people who understand loneliness can feel almost comfortable. Finally, Helen looked toward the old photograph. Tom built this house himself. Arthur nodded. My Mary always wanted a front porch big enough for every grandchild. Helen looked at him. You still wear your ring. Arthur glanced at the weathered gold band. Never really thought about taking it off. She slowly touched the chain around her neck. Arthur noticed another wedding ring hanging beneath her sweater. I couldn't wear mine anymore, she admitted quietly. So I kept it close another way. Neither apologized for mentioning the people they had loved. Neither felt jealous of memories that deserved to remain. Instead, something unexpected happened. The names Mary and Tom stopped feeling like ghosts standing between them. They became bridges. Arthur finally smiled. I reckon they'd both tell us to stop acting so stubborn. Helen laughed into her coffee. Tom certainly would. The afternoon slipped away without either of them noticing. When Arthur stood to leave, he saw several loose boards hanging from the roof of Helen's horse barn. He pointed upward. That roof won't survive winter. Helen followed his gaze. I've been pretending not to notice. When were you planning to fix it? She shrugged. Well, I figured out how to become 2 people. Arthur looked back at the barn. I've got extra cedar planks. You've already done enough. I disagree. Helen crossed her arms. I don't want everyone thinking I can't manage. Arthur answered gently. There ain't a soul in this county who doubts you're capable. He paused. But capable folks get tired too. For several seconds, she simply looked at him. Then she gave the smallest nod. The following Saturday, Arthur arrived before sunrise. The 2 of them spent hours replacing damaged boards, while frost melted from the roof beneath the morning sun. Arthur climbed. Helen measured. Arthur hammered. Helen handed him nails before he even asked. Without discussing it, they began moving with the quiet rhythm of people learning each other's habits. Near noon, Helen disappeared into the house. When she returned, she carried a pot of beef stew, warm biscuits, and apple pie. Arthur climbed down from the ladder. I wasn't expecting all this. You fixed half my barn. I only replaced 6 boards. Helen smiled. Then I suppose the stew is payment for 6 boards. They ate sitting on overturned feed buckets. No restaurant could have made the meal taste better. The wind carried the smell of hay. Horses chewed quietly behind them. For the first time in years, neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Across the road, Sarah Ellis slowed her pickup outside the ranch supply store. She watched Arthur climb back onto the roof, while Helen steadied the ladder with one hand, and looked up with unmistakable affection. Sarah smiled to herself. Later that afternoon, George wandered into her store. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" "The one that means you've spotted gossip before everybody else." Sarah laughed. "It isn't gossip." "No. It's hope." George turned toward Helen's ranch, visible in the distance. Arthur was climbing down from the roof, and Helen reached out without thinking to brush a streak of sawdust from his shoulder. Neither seemed to realize what they had done. George grinned. "Well, now." Sarah folded another receipt. "I don't think they're fixing a barn anymore. They're fixing 2 lonely hearts." Neither Arthur nor Helen heard the conversation. They only knew that the afternoon felt lighter than it had in years. But neither realized that in a town as small as theirs, happiness never stayed unnoticed for very long. By the time the first snow touched the Montana hills, more than one pair of watchful eyes had begun wondering where this quiet friendship might lead. By the middle of November, nobody in town needed to ask why Arthur's truck was seen so often near Helen Brooks' ranch. People simply noticed. Some smiled. Others whispered. Arthur paid little attention. He had spent too many years learning that honest work mattered more than idle talk. If Helen needed another gate repaired or another wagon wheel tightened, he showed up with his toolbox before she could ask. Helen, however, heard every word. At the general store, 2 women lowered their voices as she reached for a sack of flour. "I suppose it's nice," one murmured. "Or convenient," the other replied. A widower with a big ranch and a widow struggling alone. Helen pretended not to hear, but she carried those words home with her. The next Saturday, Arthur climbed onto the roof of the horse barn to replace the last damaged boards before winter settled in. Helen worked below, handing him shingles. "You missed one," she called. Arthur smiled. "I was wondering how long it'd take you to notice." "I notice everything. I've learned that." She laughed softly. "So have I." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of another truck pulling into the yard. A silver SUV stopped beside the porch. A young woman stepped out carrying an expensive leather bag. Helen's smile disappeared. "Lucy." Her daughter walked across the yard, hugged her briefly, then noticed Arthur standing on the ladder. She offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "You must be Mr. Collins." "Arthur's fine." Lucy nodded. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Arthur climbed down and quietly excused himself, sensing the family needed privacy. But before he reached his truck, Helen asked him to stay. "It's all right." Lucy looked from Arthur to her mother. "So, this is a neighbor." Helen answered calmly. "He's become a good friend." Lucy folded her arms. "You've known each other only a few months." "Sometimes that's enough." "For what?" Helen didn't answer. Instead, she invited her daughter inside. Arthur drove home feeling strangely unsettled. He had weathered blizzards, droughts, and years of loneliness. Yet somehow, meeting Helen's daughter had made him more nervous than any storm. The following afternoon, Ethan Collins arrived at Arthur's ranch carrying feed supplies. He immediately noticed a second coffee mug drying beside the sink. His father lived alone. There was never a second mug. "You having company these days?" Arthur hesitated. "Sometimes." Ethan leaned against the counter. "I've heard people talking." Arthur quietly continued repairing a saddle strap. "They usually do. They're saying you're spending a lot of time with Helen Brooks." Arthur nodded once. "I am." Ethan sighed heavily. "Dad." Arthur finally looked up. "What?" "I just don't understand." "Understand what?" "It's Mom." Silence settled over the room. "You and Mom had 30 years together." We did. And now. Ethan searched for the words. It feels wrong. Arthur set the leather strap aside. You think caring about someone else means I've forgotten your mother? Ethan lowered his eyes. I don't know. Arthur's voice remained gentle. I haven't forgotten a single day with her. He glanced toward the photograph hanging above the fireplace. I never will. Then why? Arthur took a slow breath. Because remembering someone isn't the same as stopping your own life. Ethan had no answer, but neither was he convinced. He left before sunset, and Arthur watched his truck disappear down the long dirt road with a heaviness he had not felt in years. Across town, Lucy's conversation with Helen was becoming just as painful. You should sell this place. Helen shook her head. This ranch is my home. It's too much for one person. I've managed. Barely. Lucy hesitated before speaking again. And this man... Helen looked up. What about Arthur? You don't really know why he's helping. Helen's expression hardened. I know exactly why. Do you? Lucy stepped closer. He's lonely. So am I. He has a successful ranch. Helen answered quietly. So? What if he wants yours too? For the first time, Helen became angry. Arthur has never asked me for anything. Lucy fell silent. Deep down, she knew that was true. But fear often speaks louder than reason. Over the following weeks, Helen found herself replaying those conversations. At church. At the feed store. Even while feeding the horses. The whispers followed her. Maybe people were laughing. Maybe Arthur's son would never accept her. Maybe she was asking too much from a man who had already lost so much. When Arthur stopped by one afternoon carrying fresh lumber for a loose gate, Helen met him on the porch instead of inviting him inside. You don't have to keep coming. Arthur looked surprised. I thought the gate needed fixing. It can wait. He studied her face. Something had changed. You all right? I'm fine. No. She forced a smile. I just think we've been spending too much time together. Arthur stood quietly. Did I do something wrong? Helen wanted to tell him everything. The whispers. Lucy's worries. Her own fear of becoming another burden. Instead, she simply said, I think people are talking. Arthur shrugged gently. People always talk. I know. But your son. Arthur understood immediately. He came to see me. And he needs time. Helen lowered her eyes. So does my daughter. Neither spoke for several moments. The distance between them felt much greater than the few feet separating the porch from the yard. Arthur tipped his hat. If that's what you want. Helen nodded, though every part of her wished she hadn't. He climbed back into his truck. Neither of them noticed that the repaired fence stood quietly between their two shadows. For nearly 2 weeks, Arthur stayed away. The ranch felt colder without his truck in the driveway. Helen missed hearing his boots on the porch. She missed arguing over crooked nails. She even missed the comfortable silence they had learned to share. Arthur missed everything. George finally cornered him outside the livestock auction. You look miserable. I've been busier. George snorted. No. Arthur said nothing. George placed a weather hand on his shoulder. Son, sometimes folks our age think walking away is kindness. Arthur stared toward the darkening sky. But sometimes staying is. That night, the first true winter storm rolled over the Montana plains. The wind rose with frightening speed. Snow buried the roads. Power lines swayed. And several miles away, Helen stood inside her barn as a deafening crack echoed through the darkness. One of the heavy support beams had begun to give way. She looked toward the frightened horses, then toward the telephone that had already gone dead. There was no one left to call, or so she believed. The barn roof groaned again, and this time one of the support beams split down the middle. Helen ran toward the nearest stall as the horses kicked against their doors. Snow blew through the broken boards, sharp enough to sting her face. She grabbed a lead rope and pulled at the latch, but the frightened mare refused to move. "Come on, girl." Another crack sounded above her. Helen looked up. The beam sagged lower. Outside, the storm had erased the road, the fence, and every familiar shape beyond the barn. The house had gone dark when the power failed. The telephone line was dead. She had no lantern except the one hanging beside the tack room, and its flame trembled with every gust. Then, through the wind, she heard an engine. At first she thought she had imagined it. The sound came closer. Headlights appeared through the snow like two pale eyes. Arthur's truck pushed into the yard, chains grinding against the frozen ground. Before the engine stopped, he opened the door and stepped into the storm. Helen stared at him. "What are you doing here?" Arthur pulled his coat tight. "George heard the power lines were down near your road. That doesn't explain why you came." He looked toward the damaged barn. Didn't need much explaining. Another section of roof shifted. Arthur ran inside. He took one look at the cracked beam and the frightened animals. "We have to get them out. The north pasture gate is buried. Then we'll use the equipment shed. The door sticks." Arthur handed her the lantern. "Not tonight, it won't." They worked without another word. Arthur forced open the shed while Helen led the first horse through the snow. The wind shoved against them, nearly pulling the rope from her hands. Arthur moved beside the animal, one hand on its neck and the other shielding Helen from falling boards. They brought out the second horse, then the third. The final stall held an old gelding that refused to move. Helen pulled the rope. "Please." The horse trembled and pressed backward. Arthur stepped inside the stall. "Easy now." The roof groaned above him. Helen looked at the beam. "Arthur, get out." He moved slowly toward the gelding. "It's all right, boy." A board fell behind him. Helen screamed his name. Arthur did not turn. He placed one hand over the horse's eyes and spoke in the same low voice he used with nervous cattle. The gelding stopped fighting. "Now," Arthur said. Together, they guided him from the stall. They had nearly reached the doorway when the cracked beam came down. Arthur shoved Helen and the horse forward. The timber struck his shoulder and drove him to one knee. Helen dropped the rope. "Arthur." He tried to stand, but pain crossed his face. The roof shifted again. Helen wrapped both arms around him and pulled. For the first time since they had met, Arthur was the one who needed help. Helen planted her boots in the snow and dragged him through the doorway just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Arthur looked toward the horses gathered inside the shed. "All four." Helen counted through the blowing snow. "All four." "Good." His voice was faint. Helen helped him into the house. The kitchen was cold and dark, but she lit 2 lamps and built a fire in the stove. Arthur sat at the table while she cut away the torn shoulder of his coat. A deep bruise was already spreading across his back. "You could have been killed." "So could you." "That is not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Helen's hands began to shake. She pressed the cloth against the swelling. Arthur looked at her. "You're trembling." "I'm angry." At me? At you? At myself. At this storm. At every foolish thing I said when I told you to stay away. Arthur lowered his eyes. I thought that was what you wanted. It wasn't. The fire snapped between them. Helen sat across from him. I heard people talking. I know. Lucy thought you wanted something from me. Arthur gave a tired smile. I did. Helen looked up. He continued quietly. I wanted another cup of coffee. Another Saturday fixing something that probably could have waited. Another reason not to go home to an empty house. Helen's eyes filled. Arthur looked toward the dark window. I wasn't trying to take your ranch. I know that now. I wasn't trying to replace Tom. I know. And I wasn't asking you to replace Mary. Helen reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. I know that too. The word she had carried for weeks finally came loose. When I said I needed a strong man like you, I thought I meant someone who could fix the things I couldn't. Arthur watched her. The fence, the barn, the roof. She shook her head. I was wrong. Outside, the storm battered the walls. Helen tightened her hand around his. What I needed was someone who would come when the road disappeared. Arthur's expression changed. Someone who would show up even after I push him away. Her voice broke. Someone who would stand beside me when I was too tired to keep proving I could stand alone. Arthur said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned his hand beneath hers and held it. I've loved you since the day we fixed that fence. Helen closed her eyes. Arthur continued. I kept telling myself I was too old to begin again. That caring for you would dishonor Mary. That my son would never understand. And now I think Mary would be ashamed of me for wasting so much time. Helen laughed through her tears. Tom, too. Arthur lifted her hand and rested it against his chest. I don't know how many years I have left. Neither do I. But I know I don't want to spend them pretending I feel nothing. Helen leaned forward. Their kiss was quiet. No thunder. No grand promise. Just two lonely people finally admitting that the warmth between them had been real from the beginning. By dawn, the storm had weakened. George arrived with 2 ranch hands and a wagon full of supplies. Behind him came Lucy's SUV, struggling through the snow. Lucy ran into the house. Mother. She stopped when she saw Arthur, sitting near the stove with his arm bandaged. Helen stood beside him. He saved the horses. Arthur shook his head. We saved them. Lucy looked toward the collapsed barn, then at Arthur's bruised shoulder, then at the way her mother kept one hand on the back of his chair. Something in her expression softened. I was wrong about you, she said. Arthur did not answer immediately. Lucy looked at Helen. I thought if you loved someone again, it meant Dad mattered less. Helen's voice was gentle. Your father will always matter. Lucy nodded. I think I was afraid that if you stopped being lonely, you wouldn't need me. Helen crossed the room and embraced her daughter. Oh, Lucy. Arthur looked away, giving them privacy. By noon, Ethan arrived. George had sent word about the accident. Ethan found his father outside, refusing to rest while directing repairs to the shed. You can barely lift your arm. Arthur glanced at him. Other one still works. Ethan did not smile. He looked toward Helen, who was carrying blankets into the house. You came through that storm for her? Yes. After she told you to stay away? Yes. Ethan lowered his voice. Would you have done the same for Mom? Arthur turned to him. Every day of my life. The answer struck harder than anger could have. Ethan looked toward the snow-covered fields. I keep thinking accepting Helen means I'm letting Mom go. Arthur rested his good hand on his son's shoulder. You don't let go of love. Ethan looked at him. You carry it forward. For a moment, Ethan could not speak. Then he nodded. I haven't seen you look this alive since she died. Arthur's eyes moved toward Helen. I didn't know how tired I was until she made me want another day. Ethan followed his gaze. Helen saw them watching and smiled. At last, Ethan smiled back. The weeks that followed were not easy. The barn needed rebuilding. Fences had to be dug out of the snow. Arthur's shoulder took longer to heal than he admitted. But Lucy returned twice from the city to help. Ethan brought lumber from Arthur's ranch. George recruited half the town before anyone could refuse. Sarah organized meals and pretended she had not been waiting months for this outcome. By early March, the barn stood stronger than before. The gossip changed too. People who had once whispered now brought nails, feed, and warm bread. They watched Arthur and Helen work side by side and began to understand that neither had been rescued by the other. They had simply stopped facing every burden alone. Still, one fear remained. Arthur had declared his love, but he had made no promise beyond the coming day. Helen did not press him. She understood grief well enough to know that courage sometimes arrives slowly. Then one morning, George found Arthur in the workshop polishing a small gold ring. It was old, simple, worn smooth by time. George leaned against the doorway. That Mary's. Arthur shook his head. My mother's. George stepped closer. You planning something? Arthur examined the ring beneath the lamp. I'm trying to decide whether a man my age has any business asking for forever. George gave a quiet laugh. At your age, forever just means you understand the value of tomorrow. Arthur looked at the ring again. Outside, the snow had begun to melt along the repaired fence. For the first time in months, the earth beneath it was visible. Arthur closed the ring inside his palm. And as spring approached, the whole town seemed to be waiting for him to ask the one question Helen no longer dared hope she would hear. By April, the last snow had melted from the lower fields, and green returned to the Montana hills. Helen's barn stood straight again. New boards covered the scars left by the storm, and the horses no longer startled whenever the wind pushed against the roof. But Helen still did. On nights when the weather turned rough, she woke and listened for a cracking timber. Sometimes she found herself checking the back door twice. Sometimes she carried extra bread to the pantry, as if another blizzard might trap her there alone. Arthur never told her those fears were foolish. He simply arrived before every storm. He stacked firewood beside the porch. He checked the barn latches. He left a lantern filled and ready on the kitchen table. Little by little, Helen stopped watching the road because she knew he would come. One Saturday morning, George told her the town was holding a spring supper near the old pasture line. Helen suspected nothing until she reached the repaired fence and saw nearly everyone waiting. Sarah had hung wildflowers from the rails. Lucy stood beside Ethan near a long table of pies and coffee. George wore his best coat and looked far too pleased with himself. Arthur waited on the other side of the fence. His shoulder had healed, though he still moved carefully when the morning was cold. Helen approached him. What is all this? Arthur glanced toward George. I was hoping for something quiet. George called from behind them. This is quiet for Montana. Laughter moved through the crowd. Arthur turned back to Helen. For a moment, the strong rancher who had faced a blizzard without hesitation seemed uncertain of every word. He rested one hand on the top rail. You once said you needed a strong man. Helen smiled. I remember. I've spent months trying to be one. You never had to try. Arthur looked down, then reached into his coat. Helen saw the small ring in his palm. It was not new. The gold had been polished, but time had left faint marks along its edge. "My mother wore this for 46 years, Arthur said. "My father never had much money, but he gave her every good year he had." Helen's eyes filled. Arthur continued, "I can't promise you a young man's future." She stepped closer. "I didn't ask for one. I can promise I'll come when the road is buried. I'll fix what I can. I'll sit beside you when I can't. And I'll never ask you to forget the life you had before me." Helen touched the old fence rail between them. "I was wrong that day." Arthur's expression fell slightly. "About what?" "I didn't need a strong man." The town became still. Helen reached through the rails and took his hand. "I needed you." Arthur closed his fingers around hers. Then, with more effort than he would later admit, he lowered himself to one knee in the spring grass. "Would you spend whatever years we have left together?" Helen did not look at the ring. She looked only at him. "Yes." Lucy covered her mouth as she began to cry. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. George removed his hat, while Sarah whispered that she had known from the beginning. Arthur slipped the ring onto Helen's finger. When he stood, she kissed him beside the fence that had once marked the edge of her lonely life. 1 year later, there was still a fence between the two ranches, but Arthur had removed the center section and built a wide gate in its place. Cattle moved freely between the pastures. Children and grandchildren filled both houses on weekends. Boots crowded the porches. Coffee stayed warm in Helen's kitchen, and Arthur's dining table needed more chairs than it had in years. Lucy never again asked her mother to sell. Ethan began bringing his family every Sunday. George continued claiming credit for the marriage, while Sarah continued reminding him that noticing love was not the same as creating it. On their first anniversary, Arthur and Helen walked together along the old fence at sunset. Helen's hand rested in his. Arthur stopped beside the post they had replaced on the day they met. "Best repair job I ever took," he said. Helen leaned against his shoulder. "Because it held?" Arthur looked toward the open gate, joining their land. "No." He smiled. "Because it led me to you." They continued walking as the evening light stretched their shadows across both ranches. The fence had once been a boundary. Now it showed exactly where two separate lives had chosen to meet. And if this story reminds you that love does not belong only to the young, write "It's never too late" in the comments. Because sometimes a broken fence is not the end of what you built. Sometimes it is the place where a new home begins.